Welcome to MTMG's IT Roundtable, where we bring the power of human connections to the tech world. Our experts become part of your team, so whatever tech problem is keeping you up at night, we can help you solve it.
Joining us today is Dan Wakefield, our infrastructure guru and gentleman that keeps me honest all the time. So happy to have you here, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being part of the team too. Wanted to have a conversation with you about virtualization because it is so in the news, specifically Broadcom's acquisition of VMware. It's obviously everybody's talking about it. It's really roiled the markets over the last few years. But what has been the real impact for IT teams?
Yeah, so a major aspect of it, a couple of big areas that were impacted by that acquisition were the one that stands out the most for people is definitely the pricing. So basically what Broadcom did when they came in and acquired VMware is one, they moved to subscription, which I think most of the industry was expecting. That's happening across a lot of software packages these days. But what they also did that I think really threw people for a loop is that basically packaged their software. So originally it was very much a la carte. So you would buy the different aspects that VMware had based on your needs and the level of complexity that your environment had. But once they bundled all the software, that required you to spend a lot more money for a lot of tools that you're not using. So one of the examples is customers that we used to have in their ESXi, the vCenter, and then they would attach that to their centralized storage. That was all they needed. But once Broadcom did the bundling, now all of a sudden that same package would include ESXi, it would include vCenter, but then they would also include things like Tanzu, or for the larger package where you're doing some of the hybrid cloud work, they embedded VCF, which is their single control plane across on-premise and multi-cloud. So because of that packaging together, all of a sudden customers that were just buying ESXi and vCenter had a pretty basic virtualization configuration, had all these additional tools added in, and VMware was charging for that, or Broadcom was charging for that. So a lot of customers we're hearing in the industry, we're seeing, not exaggerated, somewhere 500 plus % increases in their annual support costs. So they moved to the subscription model, which moved them out of their CapEx comfort zone into OpEx. But again, the industry was expecting that, but what really threw people off is all of a sudden, let's say their annual subscription or cost for support with VMware was $100,000, which is a decent chunk of change. That could easily grow with that next year up to $500,000 or $500,000, which is a huge impact when you're already on a tight budget and you're trying to invest in the business. So I think what that did is that forced a lot of CIOs and IT directors to ask the question, where ESXi was that easy button, the skill set was out there so you could find resources to support it and employees to come in and that were already trained. And all of a sudden they had to ask that question of, is it easy enough that it's worth paying 5 times the amount? And that's where they started to have to sit back and say, okay, well, how do I figure out the level of utilization that I have today with VMware, and how difficult would it be to consider alternatives? And that's where we start thinking about, what is that kind of thought process? What do you have to think about as you're saying, I've had this solution in place, this technology for 10 plus years. We're very comfortable with it. I have to make a decision. Do I pay $400,000 in this scenario for that comfort? Or do I take a little bit of a chance and maybe save a decent amount of that money for other projects and start looking at upskilling and new technologies for our company to use for our virtualization strategy?
So it's pretty clear the cost obviously went up for a lot of companies, but did the support shift, was that as bad as it seemed?
I think there's a lot of questions up front. Definitely, when you look at publications from VMware.com and Broadcom.com, you would see discrepancies there as the company was transitioning to being under Broadcom. So you might read an article on one that's different from the other. So there's some challenges there. There was definitely an impact to people. Broadcom wanted to consolidate with their software part of their business they already had and bring VMware into that. So there's going to be some churn with employees there that can impact support as well. The other thing that I found interesting is the price increases happening in the industry, but just the sheer number of customers that were impacted by this shift. When you think about it, the things that they added on, whether it be Tanzu or VCF, the adoption rate on those things are well under 20% of their customer base. So you're talking about a price increase that's impacting almost all of their customers at one time. And to go back to the support side of it as well, I think one of the pieces there that maybe falls to the wayside is what they did with their partner community. So when Broadcom came in, they totally slashed the partner community. And what that did is a lot of customers that leaned on their partners for that support with VMware as their trusted advisor and as their partner in the business, all of a sudden get kicked out of the partner program. And VMware and Broadcom basically mandated that, okay, now you've got to use these other partners. You're not familiar with them. You don't have the trust in them. And you got forced out of that. And so your first layer of who you reach out to when you need help, which is your partner, your trusted advisor, they may be gone the next day. And so I think that maybe caused a lot of companies a little bit of churn around, or a little bit of agita around what is the support like, because their go-to is now gone. They have to meet up with a stranger and trust them to help push VMware the way they need to go.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And I think I just saw an article yesterday that there's another round of cuts in the ecosystem. Yeah. So it's just happening again. It's really amazing, challenging. They are making it for their own customers.
Yeah, and I think in their vision, they're really trying to move all their customers up the stack, whether they want to go that way or not, right? So their ideal is that you're a VMware environment, you're using all the VMware tools, you're using VCF for your multi-cloud strategy, and that's not the right fit for everybody. That's when you start seeing savings, funny enough, when you're using all of their tools, but that's not going to be the right fit for everybody based on their business needs. So that's their vision, and they've put that vision to their partners. And that's that article you're talking about, that was part of it, was they wanted to consolidate their partners down to the partners that have proven they can direct the customer from a technology adoption standpoint towards that full stack of VMware up to the VCF and the multi-cloud. Partners that weren't pushing that, and probably because their customers weren't asking for it, got booted out at the bottom of that tiering of partners.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating stuff. But so that does lead me to a question. For teams that are heavily virtualized, how do containers or Kubernetes-based platforms change the game?
Yeah, so containers has been around for quite a few years. It's mature now. A lot of people when they hear Docker or something like that, that'll ring a bell and what they've come across. Docker kind of leads into that Kubernetes part of it. So Docker has been out there for a while. It's an easy way to convert and package up virtual workloads, I'll say, into containerized. So basically what you're doing is you want to think about an operating system and an application running on top of it. They have dependencies of each other. So what containerization wants to do, or is going to do, is it's going to take and silo the application itself away from the operating system. So that does quite a few things. One of the keys is it creates portability. Once you're independent from the operating system, everything you need to execute that application is in that container. That container can then move around to different places in your private cloud, up in AWS, into Azure, because it doesn't have the underlying dependency. So that's what containerization allows you to do. There's some other areas there. Scalability is important. When you think about a VM that's running out there, in order to increase its resources, you may add some vCPUs and RAM and things like that to the VM. But really what you want to do is you're going to need to create another VM and start load balancing so that traffic has multiple servers or VMs to hit in order to process the user's requests. Well, within Kubernetes or within containers, what you're really doing is you're just saying, okay, load up one more of this. So you already have this perfect copy of this. Say, I want to load 5 of those instead of 2. All of a sudden, you have 5 servicing the workloads versus 2. Very automated in that way. And again, portable across the different locations, whereas maybe you have the horsepower in the data center, so you want it to live there. You need to burst. Maybe you want to move that to the cloud, so you have the burst capabilities, whether it's holiday, Black Friday, you need your retail web outlets increasing, things like that. Another area is from a cost saving standpoint, and we'll separate out the upskilling requirements to move into containers in this regard. But because they're so compact, they're more efficient. So you're going to require less hardware. If you think on a virtual environment, you've got 500 VMs. All those operating systems in the VMs are utilizing resources within the cluster, not just the application. When you move that to a container, now all that horsepower is being able to be used by the container itself, and you don't have all that overhead of each 500 individual operating systems. Another area is agility. So when you talk about DevOps in environments and companies where they're developing applications, really what you're able to do is continually iterate. And one of the areas that this comes from is what they call microservices. So if you think about taking it down another layer, you have an application. Well, what if you looked at that application and you carved it up into these microservices? What that allows you to do is every time I need to upgrade, you don't have to upgrade that entire application. And that's a big load, a big upgrade, and possibly an outage. What you do is, because of these microservices, you're looking at each specific piece of the application and you can update just that microservice. So that allows you to develop code a lot faster. You're not dependent on a full application upgrade. You can just hit these little microservices and not have the impact. And what that allows you to do is iterate upon your development much faster, get it into production, and then move on to the next service or benefit from that application. And that all leads down to, again, because they're much smaller, they don't have that operating system dependence. You can reduce the footprint of your infrastructure because you're running on the hardware more efficiently. Some of the hypervisors out there are adopting Kubernetes into their environment. So VMware's adopted Tanzu. That's their Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the orchestration part of it. It's what says, bring up 5 of these with this much CPU, this much RAM, and then how many copies you want of that. So Kubernetes is really the orchestration engine around that. Something like Docker is how you create the container to start with. There's other options as well. So then you have like Hyper-V, they have Azure Kubernetes Service. Nutanix has the Nutanix Kubernetes platform. And for those in the open source world, you have things like OpenStack. They leverage OpenShift as their Kubernetes orchestration engine.
So this is fascinating stuff, but for an organization, when is it too early to go, or when are they too small to go full Kubernetes?
So full Kubernetes definitely will be a challenge, and that's going to be mostly tied to your ISVs, right? So in order for a container to properly function, the ISV has to build their application in the world of a container because you're looking at all those microservices. So I'd say all in on Kubernetes, your challenges, and they're going to be some of the compatibility challenges you're going to see in general are you running old stuff, right? Are you running Windows Server 2008? Or do you have hardware that's not going to support the drivers that you would need within that Kubernetes container environment? So there's going to be some restrictions there. Now, with that said, I don't know that it's ever too early to adopt Kubernetes in containers. Going all in might be a challenge, but ISVs, SQL Server, there's a lot of building around containers now where you out of the gate can run those in containers. So that's where, a lot like you're talking about your shift from possibly from VMware to something else, you're talking about your roadmap and your shift from VMs to something else. And how does that fit into your future roadmap? So I think you're seeing I found that some of the analysts are a little bit exaggerated on the number, at least from my experience, talking about 45% of SMBs are running containers. I feel like that's a little high, but I think definitely they're starting to see that ISVs are coming with containers, and it's time to start looking into how are we going to adopt it. And that leads to an upskilling or a reskilling conversation right away. So,
well, I think that's important. And when you also think of it from a business perspective, there's always the TCO. And we hear about that all the time, but how should teams really calculate it in this case?
Yeah, so I think it's important from a TCO standpoint to think across the board, right? Because there's the easy ones, right? So my license cost X, my hardware costs Y. Those are easy ones to figure out. Now, when it comes from a swap from, say, a VMware to something else, one of the big areas from a TCO, in my opinion, is the tools that surround it. So one of the things that VMware is known for, it's very mature, and part of that is they've built a lot onto it. So you have your ESXi, which is your hypervisor running the VMs. But then beyond that, you have, things like distributed switches. You have things like Arius, which does the operations management. So you have all these tools that are built into the VMware stack, pre-integrated. So when you think about that move away from VMware, you have to start thinking about, okay, if I move to this particular hypervisor, what does it have included that would replace distributed switching? What does it have included that might be comparable to NSX, which is some of their networking that's in VMware? So you really have to think about not just the hardware and the software, But you got to think about the tools, which are software, but that sit outside of that stack that you're going to have to add on and you're going to have to acquire and you're going to have to train on. And then even just in general, a new hypervisor is going to require you to get your people additional training. So really that TCO needs to cover all that. But then whenever you do a migration, you need to also take into account what's this going to do from a disruption standpoint to the business. How well can I do this online where my users don't notice it? They can still be productive for their 8, 10, whatever hours a day, but we can make this migration happen. So that's where some of the tools outside of tools that make the solution work, but also tools that get you there are critical to consider up front so that your migration is smooth and you understand, again, that full TCO, not just the ones that are right in front of you, hardware, software, and things like that.
Well, that also brings up a question about compatibility. What are the biggest compatibility traps when moving off of VMware?
Yeah, so definitely. So we covered this a little bit. Some of the old operating systems, old software in general. You've got all the different options, Hyper-V, Nutanix, whoever it might be. If they're pretty well established, which those ones are, you may not run into as many things like driver issues, right? NIC controllers, RAID controllers, GPUs. If you're running those, especially if they're more aged, you need to figure out, is that going to be a manual driver install, which means automation is somewhat out the window. So you need to take a look at that. So hardware is going to be a major one. If you're looking at something like a Hyper-V, great for Microsoft shops. But all of a sudden, if you're running a lot of Linux workloads, can you run into some issues there? Absolutely. I've had a lot of customers that when they're doing, like engineering customers, for example, they'll have iterations of Linux distributions so far back because they have to support their customers on those versions. Eventually they'll end of life and things like that. But for a long period of time, they've got to keep those Linux distributions running. What's that going to work like in something maybe less mature as a VMware? What's that going to run like in a Hyper-V, which is Microsoft? And Microsoft's going to support the latest of the Linux distributions, but what happens to the old ones? Am I going to run into issues with that, driver incompatibilities? I do an update to the hypervisor. Does that all of a sudden knock my NIC driver out of support? And all of a sudden that's not going to work. So a lot of things to think about from a hardware standpoint and from a software standpoint. Another big one would be take a look at what appliances you're running, firewalls, load balancers, things like that. You need to make sure you're talking to those vendors up front and understanding what hypervisor are they going to support. A general KVM that's out there, solid KVM is a solid technology, but are the ISVs going to support those, and are they going to support those long term?
It's fascinating stuff. And all of this kind of speaks to something about skills and how much weight should be given to the skills gap and having to retrain folks.
So I think that varies, and the reason I say that is it's going to depend on your maturity curve, right? So one of the things that I like to look at, and this is as we get into kind of my framework of overall, we'll touch upon again, is understanding what you have in your environment today. So your skill gap may be a lot smaller than you think. And what I mean by that is, again, if we think about that VMware stack up and down, you really need to take a look at, okay, in that VMware stack, I don't need a replacement for everything. I need a replacement for everything that's important to me. Thinking to your roadmap and say, well, what's important to me now, but also what have I planned on doing that would also leverage some aspects of that stack? And then take that and put it next to your other hypervisor options, whether it's Nutanix, Hyper-V, whatever it is, and say, okay, out of the box, these hypervisors can take care of everything ESXi is doing for me today. It's got a centralized console that's easy to use, so I don't need to worry about retraining on vCenter or something like that. But then you get down into, okay, so distributed switching. I find that to be probably one of the most important things. That's why my clients would always up to Enterprise Plus versus Standard, was almost solely because of distributed switching. And what that allows you to do is manage the networking and the switching, virtual switching in your cluster from a central console. So you think about not having that tool, all of a sudden you have to go in and manually update and configure all your virtual switching, and that leads to human error. That leads to just a bad configuration that will just make it stop working. So you want to look at tools like that. So am I using distributed switching? Yes. Whoever I go to, if that's important to me, I need to make sure they have a solution. So taking that back to upskilling is understanding what you have and what you really need to move that environment to, and then figure out where your gaps are from there. It doesn't mean you need to understand OpenStack up and down and Neutron and things like that do their networking. You may not need all that advancement. So you really need to look at what you really need out of the environment, and then you can draw a line that's possibly a lot simpler than you thought over into a new hypervisor where you're just learning your way around the GUI, things of that nature, which I think a lot of small environments, 10 less virtual servers, they might be static enough where they don't care about distributed switching. Once they set it, they forget it, the environment runs. So it really depends on where you're coming from. And that's why one of my first steps in that framework is understanding what you truly need out of the environment before you go and look at the other vendors.
I think that's fascinating stuff. And it's critical that people take that time to look back at everything they've got and what are they really using it for before they start worrying about what's the next step.
Right.
So I think on our next episode, we'll get into what some of those alternatives are. But I think this has been really great to lay the groundwork on here's what you really need to be thinking through. So thanks so much.
Yep, my pleasure, Paul. Always great to talk to you.
So that brings us to the end of today's conversation. Thank you for joining us. If today's discussion resonated with you, please consider giving us a 5-star review. Your feedback not only supports our show, but also helps others find us. Thank you so much for listening to MTMG's IT Roundtable. We look forward to bringing you more conversations soon. Until then, take care, and know our team is always here to help. Sláinte
MTMG, guidance that empowers.